Thank you for your interest and for joining us today on our municipal discussions on climate levy. We'll start with land acknowledgements. We're thankful to be able to join you from the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. How are cities funding climate emergencies and climate programs? In today's webinar, we will learn about how 3 different cities have approached funding options for climate change and climate-related programs. Hear thoughts from municipal staff on community engagement towards the city's approach, what worked well, lessons learned, and the sustainability of it all. I'll invite our first guest speaker, James, and then we will go to you, Shannon, and then Alina after this. I will stop sharing my screen and invite you, James.
I'll kick it off right now. Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Julia, for inviting me here today to speak. It's my pleasure to talk about how Peterborough has enacted its climate change reserve in a relatively small city of 80,000 people. But before I discuss the climate change reserve in detail, I first want to talk about what precipitated this municipality into taking climate action seriously in the first place. So to begin, the 2004 Peterborough flood was the catalyst that forced the city and community to take seriously the impacts of extreme weather events. The July 2004 flood was the most damaging and the costliest natural disaster that ever impacted the city to date. Extreme rainfall inundated the community with over 240 millimeters of rain in a 24-hour period. And to put that into context, I have this little notebook here. This is roughly the amount of rain that the city received in one day, which is an extreme amount for any city, but particularly Peterborough, because part of the city is located, was built on a floodplain. Not the perfect planning, but that's what it was. Catastrophic damage resulted with many basements in the downtown core flooded, and along with roads, culverts, and bridges damaged. A total of $21 million in key infrastructure was damaged or destroyed, and $96 million in insurable losses were incurred because of the flooding. The aftermath of the 2004 flood still resonates with many residents and was the pivotal event that started the city on the path to adaptation to mitigate future flooding events and forced us to begin to consider the impacts of climate change as a whole in the city. So following the flood, the city embarked on its foundational flood reduction master plan in 2005. The plan resulted in the creation of the Flood Reduction Capital Program with over 100 projects to reduce Peterborough's flood risk over 20 years. This included water infrastructure upgrades and maintenance programs to be able to handle high water levels from any kind of future events. And currently there's a capstone project that's being funded from the capital program, and it's the reduction or the construction of a downtown flood diversion project to divert high water levels from a downtown creek prone to flooding. And that the creek was one of the main reasons why Peterborough flooded in 2004. Additionally, we're working on another creek that commonly floods a residential neighborhood, and we're improving that creek's resilience with wider culverts and stream bank naturalizations. Other flood resiliency projects include a rain garden subsidy program to incentivize homeowners to install rain gardens, also known as LIDs, and the development of an integrated flood model, which is currently being developed to understand how the city's sewers, retention ponds spread throughout the community, LIDs, and the natural bodies of water that transit the city, how they will respond to higher rates of precipitation caused by climate change. Lastly, the city's also working on its watershed plan, and that's going to be looking at studying their subwatersheds in Peterborough, and Peterborough has a couple of subwatersheds in the city, and seeing how climate change will impact at-risk areas of the city from flooding. So with all these programs and projects in place, Peterborough is now well positioned to reduce our exposure to at least near-term climate-induced flood events. So the momentum in Peterborough eventually shifted to addressing greenhouse gas emissions. And in 2016, Peterborough created a climate change action plan to curb greenhouse gas emissions with a target of 30% by 2031, and with a baseline of 2011 levels. We look at the climate change action plan looks at both the community and corporate sources of emissions, especially for buildings in the transportation sector. In 2019, Council raised the target from 45% by 2030 and added a new target of net zero by 2050, after persistent resident delegations to council asking the municipality to do more about climate change. The focus of the emergency declaration was for staff to accelerate the timelines of existing projects and to develop new projects to reach that target. With all these climate actions, progress sets us up now for the introduction of the Climate Change Reserve in 2020. So after the emergency declaration was passed in September 2019, City Council received many more delegations of residents during the 2020 budget deliberations, asking the city to do more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time as the budget discussions were ongoing, the 2019-2020 Australian wildfires were raging. And if anybody can remember that, they were catastrophic. One councillor was so motivated by the climate disaster unfolding in Australia and the community delegations that were coming recently to council that he proposed the creation of the Climate Change Reserve as a dedicated way to fund climate projects to reduce our emissions. The CCR, or the Climate Change Reserve, was developed and positioned as a tool to provide additional funding for climate projects that weren't already committed to committed in other budget accounts. The intent being that when the opportunity arose to implement a climate project outside the normal budgeting process, the reserve would be available to fund that initiative. The motion passed, and the CCR added 0.25% to the annual property tax bill to generate a total of $426,400 to the reserve per year. With the CCR in place, council also requires that approval for all withdrawals from the reserve, as well as reporting back annually on how the Climate Change Reserve is funding climate projects. Unfortunately for us, the timing wasn't ideal because COVID struck right after it was ratified by council, and the CCR was frozen for the remainder of the year. Eventually, council unfroze the reserves in early 2021, which has been great. So here's a list of some of the projects that we've now been able to fund with the Climate Change Reserve. So first, we're using the fund to pay for the installation of electric vehicle charging stations for both the community of refueling and also for corporate fleet. We're also using the fund to help support our transportation department in funding a portion of an alternative transit fuel study, and that's going to help them to determine what kind of infrastructure, especially and facilities are needed to be able to transition our bus fleet to low emitting vehicles. We're also using a small portion of the CCR to fund a net zero fire hall that's under construction currently, and we are using the CCR to pay for our portion for a FCM community buildings retrofit program. And that program is going to look at our public facing corporate buildings and helping us do energy modeling and also a budgeted plan to help us reduce emissions by 50% for those buildings in 10 years and 80% in 20 years. However, with all this said, the Climate Change Reserve is not the only fund that pays for mitigation and adaptation projects in Peterborough, and I'll show you the other ones right now. So this graphic here on the left represents the scale that the other funds or city departments are financing mitigation and adaptation projects in 2022 in comparison to the Climate Change Reserve. So the first resource that the city has, or our department has, is the Sustainability Fund, and it's relatively small and used mostly for leveraging external funds. So that would be when the city would have to put a portion of a certain amount of money to be able to receive grant money. We could use this fund for that. Next, we have the Climate Change Action Plan Fund, which also is used for leveraging external funding, but also we use it mostly for implementation of projects. So we recently used it for the launch of our Green Economy Peterborough Hub, which is a low carbon hub to support our business community to reduce operational emissions. And then we have the CCR, which is also used for leveraging and funding that I noted already. And then we see the big one on the right-hand side of the left graphic. That is for a flood reduction master plan. And in 2022, we have a lot of projects coming out of that. We are paying for flood mapping. We're looking at also supporting a rain garden subsidy program. There's rainwater and stormwater monitoring, and we are using it right now for the watershed plan. When you take an even wider, when you take an even wider view, of the financing that we have. The graph on the right is a non-comprehensive list of projects that we're also funding mitigation and adaptation. So we have the urban forestry projects, and so that's mostly for replanting trees, but also to deal with our emerald ash borer management plan, where our forest is being decimated, our urban forest is. So our forestry team is working to stop that. Also, our facilities management team, they're undertaking a lot of energy projects through multiple corporate buildings, and there's lighting retrofits. We have, incorporating building automated systems, equipment upgrades, and mechanical upgrades, as well as envelope enhancements. And then we look at the flood mitigation projects, and that's for those big capital projects. That would include that downtown flood diversion project, which is being built currently, and other flood reduction projects that are in the community as well. And last but not least, our waste management department, which is constructing the city's first composting facility, which will be the most significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions once it's launched in 2023. So the beauty of the CCR, even though you see these other funds, is that it's a great resource to catapult the climate change projects, but is only one tool of the many streams of funding to fund mitigation and adaptation projects in Peterborough. And the added bonus of using the CCR is the requirements to report back to council, which does increase the profile of the projects, which helps with communicating that climate action is taking place in Peterborough to residents, which is always a good thing to do, because we don't toot our horn enough when it comes to climate action in Peterborough. So I want to say thank you for your time, and I don't know if we'll be answering questions now, but now or later will be great.
The floor is yours, Shannon.
Oh, spoiler alert, Juliet.
Oh, sorry, everyone.
Yeah, no, it's all good. Yeah, I'm still in shock, actually. You guys need to pinch me because we just got a dedicated 3% property tax increase just to implement our climate plan for a minimum of 10 years, or that's what they're saying. So that was my last slide, but it is all over the news. So yeah, really exciting. Thanks so much. Really happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. You can see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'm going to go quickly in the hopes that we can get more Q&A done, and just kind of quickly tell you the story of how this 3% tax happened, which kind of equates into $18 million a year into reserve for the climate plan here in Halifax. And we're a much bigger city than Peterborough, so I'm not trying to overshine your reserve numbers. They're very impressive. We're almost 1 million people here now in the Halifax Regional Municipality. But
Shannon, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
sorry. There we go. You can hear me?
Yes.
I don't know. Did someone mute me? I didn't do it. Okay. Zoom is so fun. So this is kind of the picture that we've been putting in front of stakeholders and council and our senior administration for a couple of years now, which is really the science-based targets for what we need to do to get to net zero by 2050, and also to try and stay within our ethically determined carbon budget, which requires us to reduce 75% community-wide by 2030 from a 2016 baseline. And, you know, having the IPCC 1.5 degree report and the climate emergency declaration in 2019 was really helpful because we were right at the start of redoing our kind of expired climate plans. And we made a decision to actually do our plan as mitigation and adaptation combined, which we had a little bit of research done on, and it ended up being really great for buy-in because some people are more interested in one side versus the other, and it's been really helpful in our engagement, actually. Okay, so we actually had finalized the climate plan and we're trying to get it in front of council when the pandemic hit. And then it was actually quite difficult to negotiate actually still putting it through. So it went in June of 2020. But the kind of concession that we made was that we weren't going to ask for any money for additional staff or resources at that time. But we kind of warned that we were coming back to ask that. And we committed to annually reporting on our progress and letting them know where we're failing and what we need to try and get on track, because it's really about the scale and the timing and the urgency, and just requires so much on the front end. Our plan has 46 actions, and they're kind of in these three major buckets of decarbonized and resilient infrastructure, prepared and connected communities, and governance and leadership. And this is another thing that we use to really try and show the timing urgency. When we were even back in our stakeholder engagements and public engagement sessions for developing the plan, each box is a week. So the first one is January 2019, whatever week when our council declared a climate emergency formally. And then you can see where our plan got approved. And then it's showing the week of December 13th, because that's when I actually went and presented on our annual progress and let them know how we were doing. And then the bottom box is where we would exceed our carbon budget somewhere in like 27, 28 if we don't adjust from business as usual mode. And we also talked a lot about the need for transformational change, systems change, how we can't just keep doing business the way we do as a city government or a utility or a provincial government, really trying to break down the system and build it again, which is not an easy conversation in a bureaucracy. We also talked a lot about the economic and social opportunity of investing in climate action now versus later. We spent a lot of time, and SSG was really great at being able to give us some financial numbers, because there's a financial model as part of the climate modeling that they did for us, to say that it's, you know, about a $22 billion investment for us to achieve our net zero by 2050 target collectively as a community, so not just as the organization, over the 30 years, but that by the end of those 30 years, we'd be up almost an additional $22 billion. We talked a lot about employment and labor opportunities, green economy, and kind of cost avoidance. So money spent now saves a lot of money in responding to impacts down the road. So on the adaptation side, trying to tell that kind of cost avoidance story as well. And we really tried to frame it as not just a drain on resources, not just a cost, but an investment to act on climate change here in Halifax. The social side, we kind of approached our plan with the lens of equity and inclusion from the start, and prioritizing our vulnerable communities first and foremost. So we talk a lot about how acting on climate is beneficial for communities. It builds resiliency, it reduces energy poverty, it builds just a better, more vibrant city on the whole. So when we were asked how things were going once the plan went through, everyone was really focused on COVID. No one really started doing anything any differently. And I had a handful of people on my team. And then pressure, like to council's credit, there started to be lots of questions like, what are you doing now? What's happening? What are you going to do since you didn't ask for money? Anyway, so for our annual, first formal annual report on progress, we did a 3-year resource plan, which is actually my next one here. I'll go back. We consulted across every department about shared accountability of the actions, mainstreaming climate thinking across all of the work that we do as an organization and with community. And we said, you know, what do you need to actually succeed in the things that we're basically giving you, telling you, asking you to lead, and we kind of came up with, okay, over the next 3 years, because we didn't feel like we could go much further than that, and focused on like we have 7 core areas that we're working on that encapsulate a bunch of the 46 actions. We said we probably need 25 more staff and some more operating money and a bunch of capital, and we actually had been working with finance for a year on this strategic initiative reserve idea. And it wasn't just for the climate plan, it was for the big city building stuff that just was beyond the envelope of what the city could afford year over year with our regular envelope of capital and operating. And so this is the table for this year and the next two on the capital side for the climate plan. So it's the deep energy retrofits of our buildings, are implementing our recently adopted EV strategy, and starting to plan resiliency into our critical infrastructure. And then we have this, our original climate capital account was started off as $750,000, then it was $1 million, and then it was $2 million this past year. And we're keeping that because it's a bundled account, and it allows us to provide money across the organization to make whatever project is happening more climate aligned. So they're buying a Zamboni, we made it electric. They're doing a road project, we added a green infrastructure component. On the resiliency side, we bought a refrigerated truck for vulnerable communities for power outages to save food that we're waiting to be delivered, those types of things. And so council and stakeholders really saw value in that. So on Tuesday, so there was a lot of debate, and finance is the one that really said, okay, we need a property tax increase. We needed it anyway. They originally proposed a 5.9% tax increase this year. That had no appetite. We looked at 3.7, we looked at 4.6. 4.6% is where it landed, but 3 of the 4.6 is specifically for the climate plan. Rightly or wrongly, it's going to be a line item on the property tax bill. There was a lot of drama when it was kind of put forward. It was actually kind of done without our consultation a little bit. So that was interesting the way it was communicated. But at the end of the day, finance and our chief administrative officer held council to account for funding a plan that they approved, that they talk a big game on, right? And so they said, listen, this is what happens typically. We approve all these really big strategic priority plans without the money associated with them. It's a climate emergency. If you want to do this, this is what you need to do. And 13 voted in favor and 3 voted against the budget at the end of the day. So when all of that was happening, we really needed to lean on our corporate communications, our stakeholder network. There was a whole group of people external to us that were organizing a letter writing campaign for residents to council. Every week there was a bundle of correspondence that went through the clerk's office to the mayor and council, all in favor of fully funding the climate plan, whatever it took. And they did that for months and months leading up to the budget vote. They did podcasts, they did some media and social media work, and that had nothing to do with us as an that was kind of arm's length from us. That was them trying to support us from the outside, which was really fantastic. We'd been doing in the implementation, we'd been doing a lot of collective impact training, not just for us, but for our partners, and talking about prototyping and like acting urgently, taking some smart risks. We did a lot of relationship building. We were lucky. I mean, there's a bit of magic and luck in all of this. There's a lot of hard work and strategy, but we've been really happy with our council. They're very, climate conscious and environmentally conscious council, progressive council, socially progressive council, and our mayor is a huge champion of the work, which is really, really important. And we wouldn't be where we are now if we didn't have that. And I think I said most of that. So now the pressure is really on to deliver. It's a lot of money to move year over year, and we're still trying to staff up, and we just moved into a different department. We just became a division, which is really exciting. When I first started as manager of the then energy and environment team, it was me and one other person. And now there's 12 of us, soon to be 13, and then we have 9 more positions that we have funding for 22-23 to really try and move the climate plan forward. But there's a lot of risk and a lot of barriers, and I'm pretty scared of what it's going to look like when I stand in front of council with my next annual report on how we've done with all that they've kind of provided us, because you're probably all facing the same types of issues with supply chain and contractor and consultant availability. You know, we don't have the systems in place for really having perfect transparency on the climate tax. Like, I'm not sure what finance is going to do to be handling this and reporting on it year over year. We have a lot of work to do to figure out our kind of structure on that. And we still have a lot of work to do across departments on change management and mainstreaming. And we have a lot more to do on public engagement, communications, and awareness, I would say. So lots to keep us busy. Thank you.
Here we go. So I'm going to talk to you guys about the climate emergency parking program that we proposed late last year. So just starting off with our land acknowledgement, the City of Vancouver is located on the traditional and ceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and we're grateful for the stewardship that they've taken of these lands and waters over time immemorial. So there's going to be a lot of content on these slides, so I'm going to make it really quick to get to the bottom part of, you know, if we could do it all over again, what would we do? But I'll just go through our goals and timelines, what the proposed program was, what we heard, and then our lessons learned. Similar to what Peterborough and Halifax have, we also have a climate emergency action plan that was approved at the end of 2020. And so our goal is that by 2030 to reduce carbon emissions by 50% from 2007 levels, to have 2/3 of all trips be by walking, cycling, and transit, and to have, you know, half of all the VKTs, so distance driven by vehicles, be by electric vehicles. And so within the plan, there was a whole host of initiatives. So on the parking front, we had the idea to implement a pollution surcharge on parking permits. We also wanted to implement parking permits citywide. Right now, only about 10% of the city is covered with parking permits. And we also wanted to eliminate minimum parking requirements in new buildings, just to kind of shift that dial towards more sustainable modes of transportation. So ultimately, our climate emergency parking program had a whole number of goals. The first one being encouraging people to choose cleaner vehicles when they're buying a new one. Of course, to reduce air and carbon pollution, and also to generate revenue. We weren't shy about that fact. Within the climate emergency action plan, we identified, like, I think it was like a $500,000 gap in funding between what we're doing today and where we need to be in order to hit those climate emergency targets. So amongst all this, we also wanted to get some curbside management of the parking, or achieve some curbside management goals for the parking as the city grows and there's more and more demand for parking on our streets. So in terms of timeline, we had a very aggressive timeline, I'll be quite honest with you. So in November 2020 is when the Climate Emergency Action Plan was approved. And so for this particular action, we had 2 phases of engagement plan. So early 2021, so basically it was like February, March of last year. And then round 2 in the summer, and targeting a decision for council in the fall. And so ultimately, for our phase 1 engagement, it was really an information gathering focus. We had the idea as laid out in the plan, but there was no details. We just said we're thinking about this pollution surcharge. We're thinking about citywide permits. Tell us what are your parking issues in your local neighborhood. Tell us how many vehicles you own. Tell us where you park those vehicles. Are they on the street? Are they in your driveway? Do you have underground parking? And what other challenges are you experiencing? And so that was the point of the phase 1. And then we would use that information to develop the program and then bring that back out to the public on what the actual program would look like. So, so phase 1, yeah, we basically had an online survey with a whole host of questions, and we had like 12,000 responses to that, which was a huge number for an online survey for us. And these were some of the things that we heard. There was a very high response rate from car owners. That's not really surprising. It's a survey about parking. And people were really concerned about impacts to visitors and service providers. I think they had the idea that a citywide permit meant that every block, every single inch of curb space was dedicated to people who held permits. So, friends and visitors might not be able to come visit them, which, wasn't the case, but that was a fear that people had. And we also heard that parking issues are quite different around the city. Like some places have very significant parking challenges where, too many cars and not enough space. And other places, it's wide open, and people are like, why do I need a permit if I can easily find parking here? We also heard that most people do have off-street parking spaces, and that most residents were concerned about climate change. So that was positive. So ultimately, we distilled all that information and came up with these kind of two initiatives that work together. So one was the pollution charge added to permits, and this would only be added to brand new vehicles that were 2023 and newer, that were higher polluting. And so we had some carbon dioxide emission levels that would determine, what rate that would be. And then secondly would be an overnight residential parking permit, citywide, for all the areas that are currently unregulated. And really the purpose of this was to be able to apply the pollution charge throughout the city. As I mentioned previously, only currently 10% of the city has parking permits. So it didn't really seem fair to apply a pollution charge to only those 10% of folks. And then the other 90% of people who park on street get to do so, continue to do so for free. So a bit more detail about the pollution charge. So there was 3 tiers, so $0, $500, and $1,000. So as I mentioned, like all vehicles that people have today would not pay a pollution charge. And it would only kick in for vehicles that were 2023 and newer. So basically nobody has a 2023 vehicle. So this is trying to influence future purchases. These numbers are really small, but any vehicles that were under 200 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometer, that would also be $0 pollution charge. If you were in the next tier, 200 to 225, you would pay $500 on top of your parking permit. And then if you're a higher polluting vehicle, you would pay the $1,000 fee. And then in terms of the overnight parking permit, so we were suggesting that the overnight parking permit costs about $45 per year. And that's the same price as our cheapest parking permits today. And that would only be in effect if you wanted to park on street overnight, so between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. During the daytime, there would be no change to you. If you're parking, from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., you would follow whatever the regulations are at the time. And if you had guests that were wanting to stay overnight that don't have a parking permit, they would pay $3 per night. And you could do that through like a mobile app, pay by phone, or at one of the local pay stations nearby. So the map on the top corner here, that kind of shows you where we currently have parking permits. So all the blues and greens that you see on the map. And then in all the areas in white, basically, you can just park on the street for free. So the intent is really for this overnight residential parking permit to apply in all those areas that are in white on the map. So for our phase 2 engagement, we kind of took a multi-pronged approach. Again, we did an online survey through our Talk Vancouver platform, and that garnered 19,000 responses, which is the most responses that we've ever had to any survey the city has ever run. I think the previous maximum was about 14,000 when we put in the empty homes tax. So clearly a lot of public interest in this topic. We also did a couple of market research surveys to get a more demographically representative sample of respondents, because in our first round of engagement, there was so many folks who were car owners and from ground-oriented houses that responded, that we wanted to make sure that we were hearing from other less represented groups. And of course, we did a whole bunch of stakeholder engagement with our advisory committees, with our climate and equity working group. We talked to new car dealers. We talked to BC Housing, which runs a lot of kind of social housing and supportive housing, as well as our Developmental Disabilities Association. So what did we hear? Perhaps not surprisingly, through our Talk Vancouver survey, that was the 19,000 respondents. People really were not supportive of this idea, and also with the idea of a parking permit. Interestingly, in the representative survey, the numbers went up a little bit more, and when we looked into the reasons or why there was such a big difference between the respondents here, because these two went out at the same time. And we think it's really because of who was responding. So in the Talk Vancouver survey, 58% of the people identified as living in a single family home, whereas when you compare to the demographics, actually only 15% of the city lives in a single family home. Same, again, heavily weighed toward ground oriented as compared to what it is overall in the city. And then if you look at the bottom item, mainly people who use vehicles as their primary mode of transportation, they were also more likely to respond to the Talk Vancouver survey. And what did we hear? So some of the common reasons of why people did not support these two initiatives. One was affordability. I think there was a really big misconception that everyone would be paying $1,000 for their parking permit fee, which was completely incorrect. Really, most people would be paying $45 because of all the vehicles that you own today. And it's really only people choosing brand new, higher polluting vehicles that would be paying that $1,000 fee. Linked to that was overall fee burden. Recognizing that we were doing all this during COVID, some people, people were impacted in terms of losing their jobs or having reduced hours, all sorts of things like that, and the impression of like throwing this extra burden, extra tax on top of what people are trying to just survive was also not well received. Sorry, I'm just gonna move my picture. There we go. Okay. And then there was also concern about people who are lower income renters and contractors, about what does either $45 fee or $500 fee, $1,000 fee, how would that impact those groups? So recognizing that there was quite a bit of misunderstanding about what we were proposing, we did a second survey that tried to clarify some of those concerns in terms of, no, not everybody is paying a $1,000 fee. Most people are paying $45. All the vehicles that you own today would be $45. And so that increased the support level a little bit. Okay, so ultimately what we brought forward to council, really the pollution charge really didn't change. So it'd still be at the $0, $500, and $1,000 fee. And that it doesn't apply to vehicles that people own today. And in terms of the overnight parking permit, we did adjust the hours of that the permit would be in effect. So instead of 10 p.m. To 7 a.m., we changed it to midnight. The $45 and the $3 fees remained the same, but we did introduce a $5 per year rate for people who qualified as being low income. And we also introduced the ability for overnight care workers to also be eligible for the overnight parking permit. And that was through their discussions with BC Housing, where some of these care facilities, they're located in the heart of residential neighborhoods, and there really isn't viable parking options nearby or on site for those vehicles, and so they often park on the street. So we did introduce that ability for certain groups to also qualify for the parking permit. So ultimately this went forward to council in October last year. There was a lot of debate. We heard a lot of citizens come out from both sides, both supportive and against, and ultimately it did not pass by a vote of 5 to 6. So very, very close. vote on this. So if we were to do it all again, what would we do? We had some dedicated staff resources, including a project manager. With a project of this scale, it's really hard to do off the side of the desk, and which is often how a lot of these projects start. And we said, no, we need to focus in order to pull this off in the timelines that are proposed. We held workshops with our advisory committees, and we brought all those advisory committees together. Often we would, visit each one individually, but we thought this really worked well because they could hear each other's perspectives. So seniors and people with disabilities heard from the transportation and the renters, and really had a more in-depth discussion of an awareness of how it impacts various people. Before each round of engagement, we held media tech briefings. So basically on the same day as of the start of engagement, we held a session and invited all sorts of media out just to give them, to make sure that they understood the program, because we knew it was very complicated. And so we wanted to make sure that, if they had any clarifying questions before they publish articles or whatnot, that they had some of the right answers about that. Similarly, we also did council briefings before and after each round of engagement. And yeah, a bit of a double-edged sword here that we had a lot of data to analyze with 12,000 and 19,000 responses. But what would we do differently if we were to do this again? And number one was really timing. We knew that anything related to parking would be contentious. We know that even from just trying to implement parking permits on a single block, people come up with pitchforks against these kinds of ideas, because there's a very strong sense of entitlement to be able to park on the street for free in front of your home. So we are very much aware of that. And in terms of timing, we really wanted to get this to council before the elections, which are happening this year in October of 2022. So we thought if we can get it to council about a year in advance, maybe that's enough buffer so that this doesn't become an election issue. But clearly that wasn't the case. That was still a big concern. Related to this, because this project was so complex and affects pretty much every household in the city, if we could do it differently, I would maybe add an extra year to our timeline just to be able to really talk to people, have a lot deeper engagement. We were, again, also hampered by COVID in that we couldn't go out and do open houses and talk face to face with people like we otherwise normally would have done. And so everything was online, which is a big barrier for certain groups in how we interact with them. If we had more time, we would also explore other tools. So for example, if we were really trying to focus on the pollution charge, a better way may have been to implement it through our the car insurance that we have, a provincial car insurance. So if you were adding a line item based on the carbon dioxide emissions of your vehicle, maybe that's an easier way to implement something along those lines. But again, with the timelines, it's hard to get our own organization on board. And then if we have to reach out to another organization to get them on board too, we just didn't really have enough time to do that. For this one, we would engage a communications and engagement consultant earlier. Unfortunately, we didn't bring someone on board until after we had gone out for our phase 1 engagement. So if we were to do it all again, I would really bring them on board from day one. Even amongst ourselves, we had so many objectives that we were trying to achieve with this program, and maybe that was too many, right? Maybe that we were trying to hit too many goals, and it made our job as trying to communicate that very difficult, because we had 5 or 6 different goals when, if you have 1 or 2, maybe that's easier to understand. And then this one's also very important, better manage misinformation. So coming out of, even after the first round of engagement, Parallel to that, there was a change.org petition that garnered a similar amount of 10,000 plus signatories saying don't do this, and a lot of that was based on misinformation, fear that people are going to be charged these huge fees, and for us to kind of manage all that and like try to get the right information out was really hard, because once it's on social media, it just spreads like wildfire and you don't know who's reading what. And then finally, really to clearly articulate, evaluate and articulate equity outcomes. We heard this through one example of like, if there's a wealthy homeowner and they get to park in their garage for free, but yet the renter needs to park on the street and pay $45 for a year. That's not equitable. But we wanted to really take it back and get to our core kind of transportation goals of, well, actually, we want everyone to just shift towards walking, cycling, and transit, and we shouldn't be pitting one car owner against another car owner. Ultimately, we want to all work together to reduce, greenhouse gases, and have a more meaningful impact on our towards our, climate emergency targets. So, a lot of work for us to do on equity, and that came up a lot in our council discussions. Yeah, and then again, with so much data, and because we knew it was very heavily from one particular group of residents, one thing to possibly consider is like maybe weighting the data or doing something to it to better reflect and make sure that other groups are heard. Ultimately, our key takeaway is really this sparked a lot of conversations within staff, within neighboring municipalities at the provincial level. We even internationally, we had other cities from Portland, San Francisco, Boston. They're like, hey, wow, what are you guys doing? Like, this is really interesting. Tell us more. So I think just putting this on the table and saying, hey, parking is kind of a big lever that we haven't really been tapping yet in terms of making meaningful change towards climate change. And so it might be one area to explore to kind of shift to being less auto-oriented in the way that we conduct our daily lives. And I think that's all for me.